Chapter 21. Plague. 28 days before the Toa's descent. The streets of Pokoro were much sparser than Macku had grown used to over the years. On any other day, the mazes of buildings and narrow alleyways surrounding the market square would be full of bustling Pomatoran moving about the village, tending to their daily tasks. Now, there weren't so many. The Matoran that were out from their homes were scattered, keeping to themselves as they moved about their routines with less confidence than what Macku considered normal. The famous market square was listless and barren, save for a small number of kiosks run by a few merchants that struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy despite receiving hardly any activity. The Pokoro Bazaar was the first sight newcomers were granted upon entering the gates, where Matoran would come to trade various trinkets, tools, or food to one another. It was considered to be one of the most lucrative trading spots on the island, making it a popular destination for all members of the Motunui Trading Guild, welcoming imports from all Wahi. Being at the very front of the village, its popularity always gave the illusion that Pokoro was much more populated than it actually was. But today, there were so few Matoran moving about that Macku was almost certain she would see a tumbleweed blow across the ground. The sight made her stomach drop, instantly confirming the guard's reports that things were not well in Pokoro.
"We need to speak to the Turaga,"
said Macku.
"He can fill us in on exactly what's going on."
Macku led Takua through the near barren streets, crossing only a few Pomatoran along the way. The Turaga's house was found near the center of the village, planted inconspicuously between similar homes on either side. Though it was larger than the other residential homes they passed on the way, it was likely Takua wouldn't have found it if Macku hadn't been there to guide him, not because it was plain or ordinary, but because every single home he had seen was embellished with impressive stonework. Ornately carved frames could be found around every door and window. Small statues of various kanohi or rahi beasts adorned fence posts and porch steps. The initial framework of the buildings beneath the beautifications appeared simple, most of which were little more than flat-roofed rectangles made of sandstone and clay, making them a blank canvas to display the artistically inclined nature the Pomatoran were known for. Turaga Onewa's house was basic only by comparison. Takua stood close behind Macku as she knocked on the front door. Almost instantly, the door cracked open, though the glowing yellow eyes that peered out from the other side did not belong to the Turaga.
"Hafu,"
Macku said with a hint of surprise.
"Where is the Turaga Onewa?"
"The Turaga's not taking visitors at the moment,"
the Matoran replied.
"He's..."
"It's fine, Hafu,"
called a familiar voice from inside the house.
"Let her in."
The Matoran nodded back at the order before opening the door all the way, gesturing them to come inside. Macku and Takua stepped inside before the door was quickly shut behind them, finding Turaga Onewa among two other Pomatoran gathered inside his living room. Macku recognized both of them. The one that answered the door was Hafu, left hand of Turaga Onewa, who was widely considered to be the best of all artisans in all of Motunui. He was responsible for creating some of the most famous statues on the island, including the cow over Naho Falls in Gawahi and the path leading to Pokoro. Despite his skill, Macku, and many others, found his inflated ego to be totally insufferable. He wore a black noble ruru, one of the more common kanohi seen throughout the island, only his was painted with precise beige accents matching the primary color of the rest of his body. Adding intricate details to an otherwise standard mask was reminiscent of how the Pomatoran decorated their homes. The other Matoran was significantly less famous than the legendary Hafu, though both Macku and Takua were familiar with him. He was the chief Pomatoran representative of the Motunui Trading Guild, Ahkmou. While most traders on Motunui ran full general stores with multiple employees, Ahkmou always worked alone, running a small market stall near the Pokoro gates. This never prevented him from turning a hefty profit, however. He had built up a decent customer base over the years as he prided himself on having the greatest selection of goods of any trader, He had a solid reputation in both Takoro and Gakoro, and though Takua wasn't overly acquainted with him, he had traded with him a number of times over the years. He was friendly and welcoming, and always seemed to have time for conversation with his customers.
Macku,
Onewa called, resting his hammer staff against the wall as he approached the Ga-Matoran with his arms extended. Macku met him halfway as he invited her into a friendly embrace. The two Po-Matoran were perplexed at the sight of their rigid, no-nonsense leader initiating a hug, but Macku seemed to have fully expected it.
It's good to see you, Turaga,
Macku said before stepping back.
We've heard about the outbreak. Is there anything we can do to help?
Onewa nodded.
we could use all the help we could get. With half the village laid up, it's difficult to keep things running.
What's happened?
The Turaga sighed.
We don't know for certain. We believe it's the work of Makuta. There's just too much adding up for it to be anything else. No one has died, yet, but it may be only a matter of time. We don't know if it's airborne or not. Hafu and I have been working around the clock to keep things running.
What about Hewkii?
Macku asked nervously.
Macku,
Onewa said with a pause.
Hewkii was the first one infected.
What?
Macku gasped.
I'm sorry, Macku. We're doing everything we can for him.
I'm going on a supply run this evening.
Ahkmou added.
I know of some herbs that may be able to ease the symptoms. I've already sent word out to the other traders for help finding them.
Can I see him?
Asked Macku.
Seeing you may lift his spirits.
Onewa replied.
But be careful. We still don't know how this is spreading.
I'll be fine, Turaga.
Macku replied.
Come on, Takua. His house is nearby.
I'll begin preparations for my trip,
Said Ahkmou.
I will head out as soon as I'm ready.
Good luck to all of you,
Said Onewa as the Matoran exited his house.
It's good to run into the two of you.
Ahkmou said to the other two Matoran as they stepped out of the house.
I just wish the circumstances were more pleasant.
Us too.
Takua replied.
Be careful out there.
Don't worry about me.
Ahkmou replied.
I know my way around the island better than most. I'll be fine.
Thank you for doing this.
Macku said.
We all have a part to play.
Ahkmou said with a nod before tapping the side of his light brown noble rao.
I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise.
Ahkmou placed his hands on both Matoran's shoulders, giving an affirming nod before hurrying off to prepare for his mission. Takua followed Macku down a narrow street, making a single turn before arriving at Hewkii's house. Beside the house was a large, open field dug into the ground surrounded by a circular stone fence. In the middle of the dusty field was a lone Po-Matoran kicking around a collie ball. He would stop between almost every kick to catch his breath, hacking and coughing before standing back upright, as though in complete denial about the sickness. Takua and Macku approached the door of Hewkii's house. Macku stepped forward, bracing herself as she slowly opened the door before they headed inside. The smell of the inside of Hewkii's home was unimaginably foul. Slowly moving toward the bedroom, they found the once great athletic champion confined to his small cot against the far wall. He certainly didn't appear anything like how his reputation described him.
Hewkii?
Macku asked quietly. Hewkii barely had the strength to lift his head. His faded orange eyes stared back at her through his dark orange great kakama with tired sadness.
Macku,
He asked. His voice was weak and raspy.
what are you doing here?
I heard about the outbreak.
Macku said.
Are you okay?
Before Hewkii could answer, he turned to his side as he erupted into a violent coughing fit. It lasted for what felt like an eternity before finally ceasing. He rolled back onto the cot, staring back at the ceiling.
Yep,
He groaned.
it's all good.
The smell of the room amplified from Hewkii's coughing, giving an explanation as to why the house smelled so horrible. The home was clean and in order, with nearly every wall lined with shelves displaying well-dusted trophies of his countless victories on the Koli field. In the corner beside his bed was a rack full of Koli sticks and balls, which appeared to be new and polished. Takua hung back as Macku did her best to speak with Hewkii. After a few minutes, he decided to break away to return to Turaga Onewa, hoping he could be of some use in helping the other sick Pomatoran. Nearly getting lost on the way, he returned to the Turaga's house. This time, when knocking on the door, the Turaga was the one to answer. He invited Takua inside, where he found that they were the only two in the home.
Is it just you?
The Turaga asked.
Yeah,
Takua replied.
Macku is still with Hewkii.
Good. I need your help.
Of course, Turaga. What do you need?
Have a seat,
Onewa said, gesturing toward the small dining table in the corner of the room. Takua was confused by the request, which created an odd tension in the air. He sat down, while Turaga Onewa took the seat across from him.
I know how the plague started.
Onewa revealed before Takua had a chance to speak.
What?
Takua replied.
How?
There's a traitor in our village. The sickness didn't occur naturally. Someone brought it here.
Takua leaned forward.
A traitor? Why would a Matoran poison his own village? That seems a bit odd, don't you think?
Look, I didn't mention this when Macku was around because I didn't want to worry her. But we may be running out of time. I've been keeping a careful watch on the sick ones, and I've noticed some interesting signs.
Takua grew more confused.
What kind of signs?
Onewa paused, letting out a deep sigh before continuing.
It's becoming clear that this sickness is a variation of the same sickness afflicting Makuta's Rahi. If it goes on much longer, things are going to get a lot worse. Someone here is poisoning my Matoran, and we're going to put a stop to it before it gets to that point.
Takua sat in silence as he felt the full weight of the situation press down on him. The case had already been urgent, with the risk of half the Pomatoran population dying of a sudden disease just after the arrival of the Toa. But the idea of them falling under Makuta's control instead was potentially worse.
So how do we find out who's responsible? We don't have much time.
The Turaga threw up his hand.
Keep your voice down. I already know who it is.
You do? Who is it?
Onewa's brow furrowed behind his noble Kanohi Komau.
It's that snake, Ahkmou.
The shopkeeper?
Takua asked.
How could he be a traitor? He seems so friendly.
You don't know him like I do. Nobody does.
But how do you know he's the one behind it? What evidence is there?
Onewa sighed.
That's where it gets complicated. There is no evidence.
Takua was speechless.
I don't understand. You're accusing him of betraying his own people with nothing to back your claim? That's not right, Turaga.
Onewa carefully selected his words before replying.
Ahkmou has a repute among the Turaga. One that has been largely hidden from the public for a number of reasons. Mostly to keep the peace and whatnot. I know it sounds extreme and may not make a whole lot of sense to you, but it's more than just a gut feeling. It has to be him.
What kind of repute are you talking about? I have so many questions.
Just trust me, alright? Like you said, we don't have much time.
Takua sat back.
If you're sure about this, Turaga, that still doesn't explain why you need my help.
Onewa looked into Takua's eyes.
I need you to spy on him.
What? You want me to spy on him?
Yeah, it has to be you.
Why me?
Onewa glanced out the window before leaning in closer.
Because he knows I'm on to him. He would be expecting me. And the Pomatoran are too trusting of him to be of much use. You're an outsider, unbiased. I know that supply run is a front. We just need to find out how. Keep this between us until it's over.
Takua slouched in the chair, tapping his thumbs together as he considered the request.
What if you're wrong?
I'm not.
And what if he catches me? I've never spied on anyone before.
Then you tell him you came to help, but were afraid he would turn you away if you asked. It'll blow the whole plan, but it'll keep you safe. The ideal option would be to just not get caught.
Okay,
Takua said reluctantly.
I'll do it. For the Pomatoran.
If there were any other way, we'd be doing that. Be careful.
Takua sat up and departed the Turaga's home. He spent the next few hours watching Ahkmou from a distance. He observed the merchant loading stacks of empty supply crates into the back of a covered wagon, forming his plan. He still felt unsure about the whole idea, but he trusted the Turaga's judgment. After all, the Turaga had always acted with the Matoran's best interest in mind. He had been assigned a duty, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he intended to take it seriously. Dusk was approaching as Ahkmou had finished loading the wagon. He harnessed a pair of Dekapi to the front of the transport before taking a seat at the front. It was now Takua's chance to act. As Ahkmou drove the cart slowly through the near-vacant streets, Takua weaved between buildings, careful not to be spotted by any nosy bystanders as he neared the wagon. This was a difficult task, as he was the only Matoran in the village aside from Macku not sporting some shade of brown or orange. Still, he managed to slip closer to the wagon. As it turned a corner just before reaching the village gate, Takua hopped onto the back and concealed himself inside the cover before anyone noticed. He could feel the wagon stop as Ahkmou conversed with one of the guards. Eavesdropping on their conversation, he could hear the guard was hesitant to open the gate, fearing for Ahkmou's safety in traveling the wilderness after dark. Ahkmou handled the hang-up with grace and respect, quickly convincing the guard to allow him to pass. Takua felt the wagon begin to move again as they passed through the gateway. He felt the wagon make a hard right turn once they cleared the village, moving southward toward the Tiro Canyon. The ride to the unknown destination was long, giving Takua ample time to think about the task. He still felt unsure about spying on a Matoran because of such a bold accusation, especially with no evidence. But if there was even a chance the Turaga was right, he wouldn't have much of a choice. Though the more he thought about it, Ahkmou's selected route did seem a bit odd. Despite being a Tawahi native, even Takua knew that traveling through the Tiro Canyon was a famously bad idea due to the high numbers of Nuijaga nests in the area. Yet Ahkmou seemed to have no trouble casually driving the wagon through the heart of the canyon. Even after the sun had almost completely abandoned them, he seemed to manage to run over every last rock and bump along the path, creating a frightening amount of noise echoing against the rocky walls from the rattling transport. After every last bump, he was sure it would be enough to summon an army of giant scorpions onto the cart, but none came. Ahkmou didn't seem to care. In fact, Takua was fairly certain he could hear the Pomatoran humming to himself as they moved along. Takua was beginning to have an easier time believing the Turaga. The wagon slowed to a stop. Takua's heart pounded as he could hear Ahkmou begin to stand up. He couldn't allow himself to be found. As Ahkmou was occupied with reaching into his satchel for a lightstone, Takua seized the opportunity to hop out from the back of the wagon. As quiet as he could, he rushed toward a nearby rock, hiding behind it as Ahkmou dropped down from the driver's seat. Takua's anxiety suddenly amplified when he noticed Ahkmou was clearly alerted by the sound. Takua ducked low behind the rock, watching Ahkmou walk to the back of the wagon to investigate the noise. He opened the cover, peering into the spot Takua had been hiding only moments earlier.
Could have sworn I heard something.
Ahkmou mumbled under his breath before stepping away from the cart. Takua continued to spy on him as he headed toward a gaping cave opening in the side of the rock face.
Matanui, what is he doing?
Takua thought silently.
That's a Nuijaga cave.
With a light stone in hand, Ahkmou casually strolled into the cave, leaving Takua stunned. He wasn't sure what type of herbs grew in Nuijaga caves, but he did know they likely weren't retrieved by carelessly walking directly inside with no acknowledgement of the dangers that resided there. All doubts of Turaga Onewa's claims quickly vanished. Ahkmou was up to something. A full 2 minutes were required for Takua to build up the courage to follow him. Once he realized he was likely no safer waiting outside after nightfall, he slowly crept toward the cave opening. Peering into the entrance, he could see the distant glow of Ahkmou's lightstone coming from deep inside. Takua tried to stamp out his fear with a deep breath, with similar results as stamping out a forest fire with his foot. He finally made the first step, descending into the cave. As he drew closer, he could hear Ahkmou speaking to someone. Takua quickened his pace, taking shelter behind one of many pillars formed inside the cave. The floor was coated in a sticky substance. Clumps of Nuijaga eggs were stacked in clusters along every corner. Takua peered out from the pillar, finding numerous giant Nuijaga scorpions moving about the cave. Their infected eyes shone like beacons inside the darkness of the cave. Yet they seemed to show no interest in the Pomatoran that stood in the center of the cave facing the far wall. Ahkmou still held the lightstone, which created a cage of illumination around his body. Takua leaned closer, hoping to hear what was being said.
The first batch worked beautifully,
Ahkmou said, though it was unclear to whom he was speaking.
I just need a little more time for the rest of them.
Well done,
said a monstrous voice from behind the shadows.
I can feel it seeping into their systems.
The athletes were easy,
Ahkmou replied.
but what about the other half? The water supply, maybe?
No, too direct. They need only to be exposed to it, not taken over entirely. We need them stagnant, demoralized, not enthralled. That comes later. Remember, Ahkmou, this is merely a diversion to occupy the Turaga.
Of course. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Takua held in a gasp. Everything Onewa said was entirely precise. Ahkmou was in league with Makuta after all, poisoning his own people on behalf of the Master of Shadows. He still didn't understand why, or how the Turaga even knew, but he continued to listen, clinging to every last scrap of information he could gather before making his escape.
I trust you have remained anonymous during this task,
Makuta continued.
From the Matoran, yes.
Ahkmou replied.
But you know Onewa. He's been on our trail since the beginning.
Without evidence of your involvement, he will do nothing. See to it that it stays that way.
I'm not so sure about that.
Ahkmou replied before slowly glancing back.
He's begun sending spies.
Takua was petrified as Ahkmou made direct eye contact from across the cave. He tried making a run toward the exit, but was stopped by a massive Nuijaga blocking his path. He inched backward from the Rahi before it reached out, clamping its pinchers over his ankle. Takua gasped in pain as he was yanked to the floor. The sticky surface rubbed against his body as the Nuijaga dragged him toward the center of the cave, tossing him forward. He landed with a sharp grunt at Ahkmou's feet.
Handle it,
demanded Makuta before his presence faded from the shadows. Takua sat up, finding Ahkmou standing over him.
You shouldn't have agreed to this, Takua,
Ahkmou said before taking several steps back, making way for 3 Nuijaga to creep toward him. snapping their claws in anticipation. Droplets of steam hissed against the floor as acidic saliva dripped from their open mouths.
You knew it was a bad idea.